Men, do you ever feel like you just can't get ahead? Like you're misunderstood? Like you have no one to talk to that truly hears you?
And women, are you often frustrated, hurt, and saddened in your relationships with the men in your life?
What if there were a community of like-minded men going through the same challenges that would support, hear, and understand what you're going through?
Working together in unison to create understanding, intimacy, and strong connections. That's the Way of the Illuminated Warrior.
Way of the Illuminated Warrior talk show is a forum of candid conversations for men and women about men. Being a man today is not always easy. Until now.
So, prepping for this conversation today, I keep thinking of the song by Edie Brickell, What I Am. So, if you aren't familiar with the song, some of the lyrics are, I'm not aware, I'm going to sing it because I have a terrible voice and you're going to suffer through it. I'm not aware of too many things. I know what I know, if you know what I mean. Philosophy is the talk on a cereal box. Religion is the smile on a dog. So the reason that song is in my head is because my guest today is a philosopher or a philosophizer, an author, a speaker, a fisherman, a mountain biker, a drummer, a husband, a father, and much, much more. So J.Aaron Simmons grew up with a deep appreciation of critical thinking, asking hard questions, and was taught by his parents, who were both professors, that truth, goodness, and beauty were well worth the time it takes to seek them. When I read that, immediately I knew I got to party with this dude. So, and I know Aaron is very into movie quotes, so I'm sure you know this, like, I want to party with you, cowboy. Anyway, Aaron has an impressive academic CV and is currently working as a professor of philosophy at Furman University in Greenville, South Carolina. So it is my pleasure to welcome you to the show, Aaron.
Oh, it is my pleasure to be with you. I have been introduced more times than I can remember, and I've never had someone serenade me with Edie Brickell. So that hands down, that wins on my record. So,
well, you know, philosophy, man. So this is going to be a fun conversation, I am sure, and very informative. So. Just for the audience, I learned of you, of Aaron, from a mutual friend of ours, Grant Weichel, a really wonderful, beautiful person also, who graciously gifted me this, and if you don't have it, you better get it, Camping with Kierkegaard, which I found really insightful, inspiring, and really enjoyable to read also. So, and I'm going to start off our little conversation because there's so much, there's a wealth of information in here, and just for me, and I'm sure anybody who reads it, really just to get us like thinking and pondering. And some people don't want to think and ponder, but anyway, if you want to think and ponder, or if you don't want to think and ponder, pick up the book and you'll know what I mean. Okay, here we go. And I have a tendency to ramble on as I'm thinking and pondering. So I'm going to shut up and read this. All right. I was overwhelmed with the realization that since we do not have an infinite amount of time, it really matters what we do with the time we have. What is worthy of your finitude was no longer an abstract question for the philosophy classroom. It transformed into the urgent question, what will I do with my finitude? And it became a matter of daily decision. So yeah, I could speak for myself. I mean, you know, the older I get, it's something I think about because we do have a finite amount of time here, and you know, yep. I like to think I'm getting a little wiser with my age, but I think about it. You know, I wake up in the morning. Sometimes my body hurts and all, and anyway, it's a great question. I think it's got a lot of value to ponder here. So I'm going to ask you, Aaron. It's a two-part question actually. So, all right. J.Aaron Simmons, what is worthy of your finitude? And sticking with this theme here, which I think is an awesome theme, how does it relate to faithfulness as a way of life?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So part of what motivated this book, as anybody who reads it will quickly understand, is a shift in my perspective. So I had spent 20 years, probably more than that when you include, you know, all the graduate work and classes and stuff, being very singularly focused on what from an abstract sense we could call my career, though I never saw it that way, right? I just saw it as being really damn good at things that I thought were worth doing. The problem was that became so singularly understood that it came at costs that I ignored. and had to almost actively ignore and narrate as being no big deal. So the example I give in the book is I was walking down the street with my son. He's about 7, and he looks at me and says, "Dad, I don't want to be a philosopher." And of course, I was like, "That's insane. Philosophers are the coolest. What's your problem?" And he responded, he was too young for irony and pretense. Now he's 15, so nothing he says is unironic and snarky, right? But back then, he just looked at me and said, "Dad, philosophers don't spend time with their kids." And it wrecked me. It was this awareness that, wow, he's right. 80, 90 hours a week at the office. I used to keep a cot in my office, and I would sleep there sometimes because I would work overnight and then get up and teach classes in the morning. But I narrated it as I'm doing all of this for my son, right? This is when he gets older, he'll understand what it looks like to sacrifice for your family. But then COVID hit, and the ability to just lean into the forgetfulness that the everyday inertia creates for us was no longer available. And so when I was stuck at home, facing my, at the time, 4th grade son, my wife, it was like, well, what can we do? I can't just go to the office. And so we started going camping, and we went to the mountains, and we spent time together. And it occurred to me, I had been lying to myself about what mattered. I love excellence. I love doing philosophy. I think if you're going to do something, freaking be good at it. But I had somehow been willing to pay the price of not being with my family, not doing things that I love, like playing drums, like trout fishing. Those things had been costs. And so the question, what's worthy of your finitude, had been a question that I had asked my students for years, right? Teaching existential philosophy and, getting them to wrestle with, what's worthy of worship and what's ultimate for you and all these kinds of big questions philosophers ask. But it had always been answered for me as doing philosophy. That's worthy of my finitude. But then when suddenly COVID broke the world and broke the normal and interrupted the inertia of the everyday, I started realizing the answer to that question can't just be this or that action. It's got to be what orientation is ultimately grounding your sense of meaning and your sense of self. And so another question that is the same as what's worthy of your finitude that I'd asked my students forever was, who are you becoming? Are you okay with who you're becoming? Great. And I realized I wasn't okay with who I was becoming because who I was becoming was a guy who in his 40s didn't spend time with his son because I was the guy in my 30s who hadn't spent time with my son. And so the book is not just about, hey, prioritize your family. The book is about distinguish between two different orientations. One I call success and one I call faithfulness. Success is the idea that checking boxes of external accomplishment defines you as meaningful. My life will have been worthwhile if I get that promotion, get that car, get that relationship, whatever it is, right? But faithfulness says, look, you can be successful, but don't be defined by it.
Right.
And maybe you fail at some stuff. Don't be wrecked by it. You are not reducible simply to the accolades and the trophies or the list of failures and rejections. And so faithfulness, I drew from this philosopher Kierkegaard, from other people like Nietzsche and Jean-Paul Sartre and this host of existentialists. And it's the idea that life is defined as vulnerable. We are finite, which means that we're going to die eventually. And so when we lean into whatever we decide to do, it's risky. We could have chosen other stuff. And so this idea of embrace that risk and then be intentional about the direction of your life. So risk with direction is the definition I give for faithfulness. It's not a religious idea. It's an existential one. So for me, what's worthy of my finitude? The answer I want to give is living faithfully. And that means being intentional. When I'm teaching my classes, I'm there on purpose. When I'm with my son, I'm there on purpose. When I'm writing books or giving talks or riding mountain bikes or trout fishing, I'm doing it on purpose as a willed, intentional mode of reflective life. And so the hope is that people can then say, well, what is faithfulness for me? What is worthy of my risk? And what direction am I okay orienting my becoming? And so this book doesn't tell you, it's not a 7-step trick for living well. It's an invitation to recognize the stakes of what meaningful existence as finite, flawed, fragile human beings is all about. And then it says, so figure out what that looks like in your circumstances and do the best you can to rock it.
Beautiful, man. Beautiful. Well, it can't tell you, I mean, but you do have some really good guideposts along the way. And, I live in Asheville. I know you grew up in Tennessee, and you're an avid outdoorsman. And so you're around these parts and these mountains and Appalachians. We could have a conversation about that, how wonderful it is, So yeah, there's a lot of direction in that book I found, which I relate very well to, like you talk about humility and hospitality and gratitude, which we could touch upon. But I want to back up a little bit. As you mentioned, your son Atticus. So I raised 3 kids, and from the time my first son Jonah was born, my life changed, because a lot of what I hear you talk about is really, to me, it's about being present and awareness, and I was, I partied a lot when I was younger, which a lot of us did. And I really wasn't very present, and I really wasn't very mindful at the time, having, kids really kind of like slapped me into shape and said, hey, dude, you took this on, you intentionally became a father, you want to be the best dad you can. So things that I relate to in the book, and I could see, the little that I know about you, that had a profound effect on your life as well. So being a philosopher, I always find it interesting. Like, I imagine, like, maybe not the basic tenets of what you believe, but things change as we change, right? As we grow. So what would you say, like, what was some of your primary, like, beliefs that you really said, okay, this is how it is for me, but as you've grown in your wisdom and all, maybe have changed, and that would want to share with the audience?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. So one of the things that I often explain when I give talks about the book is the specifics of the direction, right, are likely, and not just likely, they will necessarily change as we age. So when I was 20, if I had, had this framework of faithfulness for success, which I didn't back then, but if I had, I would say, well, I'm trying to live faithfully toward, getting educated in ways that then open up the spaces to do the kinds of things for a career in ways that I find compelling. I want to live a life that I not only enjoy, but also that I find worthwhile. But I didn't have a son. I didn't have a wife. Like, those weren't parts of what mattered. But now at 46, of course, being a good father, being a good husband, being a good professor, a mentor to my students, those are more specifics that weren't available when I was 20. When I'm retired, then, being a good mentor to my students will now look different, right? Being a good father, my son may have kids. And so now what that means will look different. I probably won't be able to hit, gnarly downhill mountain biking trails at 70, though I hope I'm still riding.
You might,
we'll see. If bikes get good enough, right?
You won't heal as fast, but you might still do it.
I'm currently recovering from a knee injury from 4 days of downhill mountain biking and snowshoe. And you'd think I had crashed and messed up my knee. No, it was, I rode for 3 days, and then while sleeping, somehow twisted it and woke up the next day. Like my brother says, I'm at the age where sitting up too fast can cause injury, right? But the idea is, I think that it's helpful for people to think about becoming versus being as a general framework. And then this allows them to talk about logistics as distinguished from character. And what I mean by that is this. When I was 20, the logistics required to live faithfully toward, a life of meaning was, well, I've got to finish college. I've got to think about grad school, which means I've got to take the GRE test. Like, those were logistical hoops I needed to jump. But getting the college degree was a box to check along that logistical arc, but it didn't make me a better person. It just made me somebody capable of going to graduate school, right? Yeah. And so when we think about what specific things do I want to do where I'm at given my circumstances, it's helpful if we think about those as being goals. I want to be a college graduate. I want to be somebody who hikes the Appalachian Trail. I want to be somebody who spends more time, in Brevard, right? Which is my favorite town outside Asheville. So I'm going there this afternoon to look for a new bike. Like those logistics are not the same as the becoming goals. So for example, when I say I want to be a good father, notice the problem with that. Let's say on a Tuesday, I crush being a dad. Ice cream for breakfast, mountain biking ride in the afternoon. We go see a movie that night. He goes to bed and gives me a hug and says, "Dad, this was the best day ever." Well, if the goal was to be the good father, I've checked that box. I guess I should leave my family, right? Be the George Costanza who walks out on a high note. But if I instead realize, no, being a good father means never thinking that the logistics of getting him a bike and some body armor and driving to the mountains, that's not being a good father. Being a good father is every single day striving to become the father he needs me to be, right? It's not a thing that I will check a box and be done with on a Tuesday. It's a constant orientation. When we get that, when I go back and say at 20, my real faithfulness goals weren't get the college degree. That was logistics. The real faithfulness goal were, can I be someone who will eventually be the kind of person who takes seriously the task of fatherhood, or the task of professoring, or the task of being a mentor? Am I developing virtues that will be the virtues I want to mark my life at 40? Right. And so in the book you mentioned, I talk about humility, hospitality, and gratitude as like the three key virtues we learn on the trails. Right. You don't get to claim this trail is mine. You have to share the trail. Yeah. You have to be humble enough to realize the mountain will break you if you aren't careful. Rattlesnakes tend to be, more venomous than your blood. So learning this humility, being hospitable to others, and surprise and adventure creates this sense of awe and gratitude about finding ourselves these beings that we are, right? But notice, when I cultivate those virtues, I can do that as a 20-year-old college student so that those virtues become normal for me at 40. If I instead say, no, I just want to get my college degree, check that box, to hell with virtue, I'll worry about that later, we forget that we always are today who we are becoming tomorrow. And Aristotle's the one who teaches this lesson. What we cultivate as normal and make a habit will become for us the thing we unreflectively embody later. And so for me, becoming goals are about, what kind of person do you hope to have been? And that will probably be consistent across one's life. Do you want to be kind? Right? I tell my son every morning, what do your mom and I care about? And he says, that I'm kind. And then we say, what do we not care about? And he says, that I'm rich. Now, do I want him to be success? Sure. Oh, sure. He's got an investment account. We're already talking about, getting him Roth IRAs and teaching him fiscal responsibility. Yeah. But I don't ultimately think if he checks the box of rich, I've been a good dad. Right. It's, did he make kindness easy and normal? And did I model that for him, whatever the logistics that we were navigating at specific times in our life? And that's what I'm hoping to invite other people into, because I think too many of us, driven by the success model, we are absolutely exhausted by what we perceive as a lack of agency, right? We feel like the rat race, the pressure cooker, the need to keep up with the Joneses, all of this becomes such an intense, baggage that we think, I don't have, or it'd be great to go biking. I don't have the flexibility to do that. I don't have the freedom to do that. I wish I was a full professor. Then I would go. And what I'm trying to say is, right, the logistics for me look different than they did when I was 20. The logistics for me look different than they do for you. Some people, because of systemic injustice, don't have the flexibility that I have because of the privilege I embody.
Yeah.
We can fix those justice issues. They're hard, right? But that's a social task we can work on. But what matters for me is that no matter your circumstances, agency, decision, riskiness, these things are real and they are activated. And so we've got to lean into that. As a theologian friend of mine says, when we drive to the office, we've got to remember we can let the song finish before getting out of the car. Absolutely. And maybe that act of resistance is transformative for reminding us that we are not defined by our job. We have chosen to do this thing, even if it's not what we wish we were doing. It's what we're doing right now because that's where we find ourselves. And if we want things to be different, let's work together in community to create spaces where agency, flexibility, more autonomy are more distributed among the neighbors that we share the world with. Right?
Oh, amen to that. Yeah. We'll be right back after this. Hey guys, this is Waska. Listen, if you're hearing my voice, there are no coincidences. Are you ready to get unblocked and take the next step forward, whether it's with relationship issues, finances, or just moving into the next phase to elevate yourself? Listen, bros, this is what I do. I'm here for you. Drop me an email at Waska, that's WASKA, at illuminatedwarrior.com. We will work on this together and take you to the next step. I promise you'll be glad you did.
The thing that I'm trying to do in the book is to say, I'm not trying to tell people what to do with their time. I'm trying to remind people that they are always choosing that, whether they want to admit it or not. And when you live into that choice, sometimes you feel pretty constrained, right? When I was in grad school, like I didn't have nearly as much flexibility as I do now. But it's also important to remember, but I could study at a coffee shop or I could study at home. And if I didn't have a vehicle, I can study outside on the porch. Like knowing that these little teeny things that we choose actually remind us that we are not reducible to an algorithm of employment, right?
That's a great point.
Jobs matter, but they matter because people do, not the other way around.
Yeah, you make some really great points in there. And I think that the paradigm has changed and it is changing like back years ago, decade, 2 decades. We didn't even think of these things because, this is the way it is. This is our society. This is our paradigm. This is what we're taught to do. And the things that I'm hearing you say, like, whether it's mountain biking, whether it's a sport, whether it's teaching our kids, it becomes muscle memory. What we think is what we become, just like you're saying. And I think it's so important. And that success model, especially as men, I mean, it's ingrained in us. It's like, you got to make the money, you got to get the car, you got to get the house, you got to get, and that becomes like a very ingrained, stressful way of life. So you probably know the do, be, have paradigm. It's like, I'm going to do whatever the hell I got to do, and I'll be whoever I have to be because I got to have this stuff. And that's the overall pervasive mindset of most of us in society, as averse to, like what I'm hearing you're describing, is the be, do, have. Be the beautiful person, be the great father, be at peace with yourself, and do whatever it takes to maintain that, stasis, that beautiful way of living, you'll have it all. You'll have, because you won't even necessarily be chasing after the dollar. You'll be chasing after peace of mind and love and beauty and compassion, all the things that we really, I'll say innately really thrive from, but are like kind of diverted away from that. So it's,
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. So we don't want to, and I say this in the book enough, hopefully, that people don't miss the point, but not so much that they think I'm being preachy. I do not think that we can think existentially without that opening on to questions of moral life and justice, right? So it's important to realize that in global senses, poverty prohibits the expression of human dignity far too often, right? We need to work on that. We need to change that.
Yeah.
And sadly, those disparities get cashed out in unbelievably problematic, historically contingent ways associated with things like gender and race and sexuality, right? That said, it is crucial, I think, for us to take very seriously that even in the context of such injustice, when we are fully invested in the task of becoming, we should not miss the global statistics that point out almost all of the happiness quotients and the contentment quotients are not held by the wealthy, right? It's almost always in spaces where enough is had, right? So again, that's the point that we've got to think about in
countries who have the highest happiness quotients.
And those spaces is like, well, how is it that we can foster community? We can foster relationships. We can foster an awareness of our vulnerability as a shared task. And so when we take that seriously, we get at what the ancient Greek philosophers called ataraxia, which is this sense of contentment whereby we are able to find fulfillment not in having X, Y, or Z, not in an external achievement, but in a relationship to our own existence, whereby we are not defined by success, nor are we wrecked by failure. And so it's important that we not forget the justice task, but it's equally important, I think, for us to start by spreading this existential awareness that would motivate the justice task, not as, again, just an external box to check, but instead as a real lived practice of wanting to say, hey, I am more likely to live a contented life when my neighbors do too. Right. That's just part of what this happiness quotient relative to community means. And we know now that having 3 very good friends in your old age is actually as important for your health as the cessation of smoking. Right. And it turns out that's just what the existentialists have always been telling us.
Well, it's community.
You are not only
part of a tribe.
Well, you're not only vulnerable, you are relational.
Yeah.
And so when we take that up, it's, in my opinion, it's invigorating. And so I would ask people, whatever their circumstances, whatever their, bank account, whatever their situation, if that's not the way that we wish it were, let's find ways to fix that. Let's work together. Let's help each other. But whatever those circumstances, stop thinking, if only we can fix this, then I'll be happy, right? Because far too many live in that if only, then I'll logic. And the problem is, as I tell my students all the time, y'all keep saying, if only I can make it to the weekend, then I'll be okay.
Yeah.
It's like, no, you won't. You'll just get to Saturday and be the person you are now, right? And so they think, oh, well, if only I can get that internship or get to law school or get that promotion, then I'll be able to rest. It's like, no, you'll be addicted to the energy that you've had to deploy so that you don't know how to rest. And that's what I'm trying to invite people to kind of lean back into, is the human condition is not something to escape by going to work, the human condition is something that should define how we do what we think worth doing.
Yeah, I've always told my kids, which is it's easier said than done, but I did walk my talk. Find something that you really love to do, and you'll figure out a way to make a living at it, because you spend so much time working. If you don't enjoy it, then it's a four-letter word, you don't want to be doing it, and so listening to you with this success motivation from so many, it reminds me of my favorite philosopher, which you probably can't guess who it is, but it's an A.A. Milne character, Winnie the Pooh. So I don't know if you've ever read.
Love it.
Two of my favorite books are the Tao of Pooh and the Tale of Piglet. So it's Taoist philosophy. It's the writings of Lao Tzu and the Tao Te Ching.
Yeah.
So what I think speaks to what you're talking about, and that whole paradigm is keep sharpening your knife and it will blunt. Fill your cup to the brim and it will overflow. Care about what people think and you become their prisoner. Chase after money and your heart will never unclench. Do the work and step back. The true path to serenity. And that's really kind of what we're talking about, which I love that philosophy. It's like, chill out, dude, enjoy your life, and remember what's really important here. Because at the end of the day, the end of our lives, I'm sure you've heard that. Like nobody says, I should have worked more. I should, you want to be with family, you want to be with friends, you want to be with community, you want to express your love that maybe you didn't express while you had all these materialistic things that were in your head and to success. And also it's a paradigm, I think, as a world, really, we'd be so much healthier if we took these things into consideration, So I love the book and I love what you bring up. My take is by design, we are meant to not think about these things. We're meant to stay busy so we can pay our bills or buy a new boat or whatever it is. And it's a vicious cycle. It's like that Mobius strip. It's the snake eating its own tail. And when do we get out of that circle, right?
Yeah. No, I mean, and it's important. So think about it. Power, whether that shows up as bosses or political institutions or social norms, power only works well when it is invisible. And how do we let power structures become invisible? We take them for granted as obvious and necessary. We don't ask questions about obvious stuff, right? And so the point of philosophy as such, I think, is putting question marks where everybody else put periods. And so that doesn't mean that we're doing it wrong or that what we're doing is bad. It just means that if we give in to the forgetfulness of the inertia of the everyday, we necessarily confuse our existence with our productivity. And we can confuse our dignity with our market capacity. And look, many of my very good philosophical friends have written amazing books defending versions of capitalism. I actually kind of agree with my buddy Aaron James, who talks about leisure capitalism as actually a really good model. So this isn't some sort of, hard left, yay, communist account that I'm providing. I'm saying, what if we instead, so I was just, for example, at Snowshoe and there was a Porsche rally. So, like 400 Porsche cars and drivers roll out. And it was a really cool community. And we went out, the guys I was mountain biking with, and met folks and talked and geeked out about cars and stuff. But what if we, instead of saying, oh my goodness, I'm so impressed with your car, we started saying things like, yeah, but have you actually got time to drive it?
Yeah.
Right? Like, I'm more impressed by that. Or a buddy of mine who is a cardiologist, makes more money than I will ever see, has a really cool mountain bike. And I was like, dude, we should ride together. And he was like, oh, I would love to. I think I've got a day where I'm not on call in like 6 weeks. Let's get it penciled in. And I'm like, wow, what would it look like if we started admiring and cultivating and desiring time doing what we enjoy and making joy the thing that is the actual capital of our investment, instead of thinking, I've got all this money, I've got all this power, therefore you should be jealous of me. What if we started saying, man, like, that's a cool house, but are you ever home?
Yeah.
Right. And so my buddy Aaron James talks about the idea that he loves surfing. And he says, though he enjoys being at the office and doing good work, which I do as well, he's like, if I don't go surfing, I forget why I go to the office. And going to the office reminds me the importance of all kinds of other stuff that then throws me back to the ocean the next day, right? We've all got to find how is it that we can navigate what we now call a work-life balance.
Right.
I would simply say, how do we navigate the multiplicity of loves? How can we love more than one thing? Only when we take seriously that the object of our love is not a given. It could be otherwise, it could be rethought, it could be redone, it could be restructured. And that's what power wants us to forget. When we are fearful and when we are gripping with death clinches, the stability that allows us to forget our vulnerability, we actually fail to be human. We become the very objects about which we worry when we talk about AI and self-driving cars. We are just those things. And so by leaning into existential philosophy, and for me, going to the mountains, it reminds us, as Martin Heidegger would say, you are never a mere thing. You are someone for whom the question of your own existence is active. And yet that question gets shut down when we take seriously the obviousness of the world as, in fact, something that we just ignore and let ride. If we can maybe interrogate that, then I think we can refuse to be reducible to a mere thing and instead cultivate our humanity by inviting others to cultivate their own.
Yeah, beautiful. It's asking those questions, putting those question marks, like you said. And I think, the paradigm we're existing now is that strive for power. But I see it more as it's really not power. It's force. There's a difference between power and force. Power, is really, to me, it's more, I'll say, if this makes sense, it's more organic. A force is, give me that, it's like a synthetic type of a will, so I think that's what we're experiencing, a lot of that.
Well, and that's what Simone Weil, the amazing French philosopher, she actually talks about the Iliad, the famous, text by Homer, as the poem of force. And she says the whole thing is about unmasking and diagnosing the workings of force that then we forget about in our own lives. And so she says, when we look at that book, we can recognize human relationality is where Achilles and Priam, find each other. The love between Paris and Achilles, the Patroclus and Achilles, excuse me, and the mode in which we find their humanity expressed as maximally vulnerable. That's where we actually reject force as necessary for human flourishing. And so if anybody has not read the Iliad or Poem of Force by Simone Weil, wow, is it fantastic.
Nice. And then it leads us to the Odyssey.
That's right. That's right.
So what I do want to ask you is a question that I read in the book, which I think is really pertinent. What, and very practical also, what can you do when you feel like you can't do anything?
Yeah. That's such a good question. So it's weird. In speaking to lots of different audiences with the launch of the book, the thing that has been interesting is you might say kind of, word map of questions and concerns that show up in different audience spaces. So when I meet with college students and speak to college students, I just got back from a college tour through the upper Midwest, and it was fascinating. They all want to ask the question, hey, we love this. This is great. We want to be faithful. So give us like 5 practical steps that we can do it. And I was like, guys, you realize that turns it into a success task now. Like you're checking the box. I want to be more faithful than you. And so this is understandable, right? Because we've programmed them since they were like 4 to think anything worth doing can be put on a resume and presented to others in a competitive fashion. And so that's so remarkable to me, because the other space where I get that same version of the question is when I speak to businesses, because they enter the space with a set of assumptions. How can we then replicate? How do we scale? How do we put this into a profit loss model? How do we maximize revenue? How can faithfulness be a new cultural norm that we can deploy in our company to increase productivity, right? They also are acting the same. How do we check boxes of faithfulness?
Yeah.
But there's two spaces where I do not get that question. I get the question you're asking. So how can I do this not to check the boxes, but I'm faced with a kind of overwhelming temptation to despair. And how do I fight that long enough to be able to start enacting the virtues that will make habits of faithfulness? And I get that version of the question in two spaces. One is with retirees.
Yeah.
And the other is with very successful people. Now, that's fascinating to me, right? Because notice the very successful person, whether they're 35 or 52, they are asking this question because I did all the stuff. None of it gave me what I was looking for. I hear what you're saying and you're scratching where I itch. That's what I'm missing. But how can I get there? Because all I know is work harder, accomplish more, make more, and those aren't doing it. The despair of the inadequacy of a success model has made it such that I want faithfulness. I don't know how to enact it because all of my habits cut the other direction, right? And with retirees, it's fascinating because they're asking that question in the context of a society telling them they're now worthless, useless, no longer part of the value model by which we understand our culture. And so it's fascinating to me because when I speak to those spaces, and this is my attempt at an answer to the question, what I tell them is start thinking about, well, what are tiny little ways in which you can start reprogramming yourself away from the dominant voice in your head? So if the retiree is saying, I'm worthless, I have no point, there's nothing I can do, well, what is something that depends on you? Right? My dad, for example, is 81. He's retired recently, retired at 79. So like this dude like maximized his work years, right? And he works in his yard and has created an absolute tapestry of beauty in his backyard to the point where now my mom and he will invite, neighbors over and they'll just sit in the backyard and have tea or coffee. And for him, it's not about showing off his greatest work. Mine's better than yours. It's about this yard will go to crap if I don't get out of bed and make it beautiful, right? The person who says, well, my grandkid, they don't have another grandparent speaking into their life about wisdom. That's a thing I will now take up as important. I had an 86-year-old woman join one of my live streams, which I do through my Substack, Philosophy in the Wild. I do bi-monthly or like every other month. So I don't know if that's bi-monthly or whatever it is, but every other month I do these live streams where it's just, hey, let's just talk. What's on your mind? And anybody who's a paid subscriber gets to join. And she's 86 years old, living in a retirement community in Texas. And she said, I'm trying to figure out how to get my 18-year-old grandson to take seriously the ideas in this book because this is what he needs to hear. And now notice what's so cool about that is she's now finding a task and a purpose in trying to be for her grandson the kind of model that she wishes, right, were easier for her to live into. So what I will say to these people, whether it's the successful CEO I spoke to a few months ago, and he calls me and says, I've got everything I ever wanted and I'm miserable. And I said, but what did you want when you were 6? And he said, well, I wanted to be a guitar player. And I was like, all right, can you play guitar? He's like, no, like I never learned. And I was like, all right, hang up. In 6 months, I want you to call me and play me a song.
There you go.
Right? So whatever the thing is, stop thinking that it's how do I change my life? Well, we don't change our life, we change our practices. And our practices create different lives that become unexpectedly normal for us. So that's my answer to when you are faced with despair, when you're faced with the impossible, what I would say is find something, no matter how small it is, and lean into agency being real for you.
Yeah.
Sisyphus, as described by the philosopher Albert Camus, Sisyphus talked about somebody who's got an impossible task, right? Push the rock to the top of the mountain. It'll always roll down. You'll never succeed. And so we think this is a tragedy. And in fact, Camus describes Sisyphus as the modern worker. He says, what Sisyphus is tasked with, get the rock to the top, it will always roll down. Push it back up, it will always roll down. You'll never get it to the top so that you can walk away. That's what we call adult existence, right?
Well, set up your lemonade stand at the bottom, and
it's utterly depressing. But what Camus says is, we imagine Sisyphus happy. How in the hell are we imagining him happy? And the answer is because Sisyphus has something that he gets out of bed to do. His rock, says Camus, is his thing. So when I teach this, I have my students literally go around campus and find a rock that is small enough to keep with them the rest of their lives. And I tell them, set it on your shelf, set it on your desk, wherever you go, so that you always remind yourself, what is my thing? What is the thing where my agency is deployed? And you might say, well, but Sisyphus was condemned to roll the rock. Wrong. Sisyphus's condemnation to roll the rock made possible the fact that he could spite the gods by doing it joyfully.
Yeah, enjoying it.
And so the fact he could say, what you meant for misery, watch, you will not rupture my humanity. I will be more than my circumstance.
Yeah.
And that's the thing that I think, in the face of the impossible, do what's possible. And there's always some glimmer of agency that will start shining more brightly and then open up even more spaces where possibility can be, pronounced and can be enacted.
Yeah, beautiful, man. Well, it's choice. It's all choice and stepping out of that box. It reminds me of the Buddhist, the Vietnamese Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh, who was imprisoned during the war, and same thing, just like him. And I know you speak about Reuben Hurricane Carter. I believe I heard you speak about it. You could take my body, you can't take my soul. You don't own my spirit. I will decide. Just like Sisyphus, I will find joy whether you want me to or not, in spite of you, So these are all choices, So what is your finitude? Yeah. So
that's right.
Before I leave us, I want to show the book again to the peeps. Awesome book. I want to highly recommend it. So before we leave, Aaron, what would you like the last thought you want to leave the people with?
Yeah, so I will lead them with two things. First, I'll lead them with ways to get in touch with me. So they can go to my website, JAaronSimmons.com. And I would highly recommend they check out my Substack, which is simply Philosophy in the Wild. I do 2 posts a week there. There's paid and free options available. And my YouTube, Philosophy for Where We Find Ourselves. So all of that is available via JAaronSimmons.com. But then the philosophical thought or encouraging
thought.
Gotta leave on
a philosophical thought, yes. You wouldn't be an appropriate philosopher if you didn't leave on a philosophical thought.
You got to leave on a high note. It's this. It's when we stop thinking that we can get rid of risk, we then will realize that choice happens not whether to take risks, but it occurs regarding what risk we think is worth taking. And this matters because I think so many people are working so hard to minimize risk and maximize security. And in some places, I get it, right? Again, that's logistics. But when it comes to life, on a long enough timeline, the survival rate goes to 0. And as I tell in the book about my mentor, a guy named David Kangas, when he was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer, that day he wrote a bunch of us that were his friends and students. And he wrote us and said, in the end, there is the unmanageable, but we would be trivial beings without it. So onward with my day. And for me, man, I don't know if I'm the kind of person who, with that diagnosis, sends that email. And yet,
Yeah.
I sure hope that I am living a life trying to become that sort of person. And so that's what I would encourage folks with is risk is not something that we can erase. It's something that is constitutive. It's part of who we are. So make sure the direction of your risk is conscious, purposive, intentional, and ultimately something that you will have been okay naming your life. And that's what I'm trying to do for my son. It's what I'm trying to do for my students. And it's what I'm trying to invite everybody else to do for their spheres of influence.
Oh, beautiful, man. I love that. And I think your mentor had a very wise philosophy about his life. It reminds me of another great philosopher, Paul McCartney. And in the end, the love we take is equal to the love we make. So
Love it. Love
I will leave it on that.
Seems appropriate. Start with Edie Brickell, end with Paul McCartney.
There you go, my brother. Well, this was
Symmetry.
beautiful, man. I really appreciate you joining us today and sharing your wisdom. And again, highly recommending camping with Kierkegaard and connecting with my brother Aaron here. Thank you for being with me today.
Thanks so much for having me. It's my honor.
Well, I'm going to leave with a quote from my father. Thanks for being had.
I'll take it.
All right, brother.
Visit IlluminatedWarrior.com if you'd like to go deeper and find out more about what's available within the Illuminated Warrior men's transformational community. Tune in next time for more candid conversations for men and women about men on the Way of the Illuminated Warrior Talk Show. Until next time, illuminate your path with loving kindness.